is working. Good. Okay. I just wanted to check that because we'll also put a recording of the webinar, a link on the Manager and Mentor section of the PDS website, so that the information that we give you today will be fully available. So to provide some understanding, and we're going to finish up obviously with a brief discussion of links from the PDS through the TPP. Slide doesn't seem to be working. Okay, a word about why use the PDS. It's obviously become the industry standard, and we are in fact making great efforts to try and reach out to local authorities as well to get them involved. And one of the important things about that is that it does make the scheme portable. So if people move from organisation to organisation, and indeed from private to public sector, hopefully they can take their PDS work towards qualification with them. So that's quite important. As ever, we think we've got about 400 trainees on the scheme. It's always difficult to be precise, because the registers always go out of date, and we're always banging on about trying to get people to send in up-to-date versions. But it's around 400, and that's been fairly constant for the last couple of years. We've had 23 completions so far, and in fact, I say here we've got 4 final reviews planned by the end of June. That make that 5. We've just had another one in today. So it looks as though we will definitely be into double figures in terms of completions this year. And as before, the PDS is available under license to the stakeholder members of the society. I'm going to hand over actually to Christine for a bit, and then I shall come back and talk about other aspects of the scheme. But for the time being, I'm going to hand over to Christine.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I'm just going to take you through the actions that you need to take in order to get started on the scheme. Now, there's a number of slides here, but I'll just run through each of the points in turn and give a little bit of an explanation about them. So first of all, it sounds really obvious actually about discussing whether the PDS is the right career path for you, but it's something that you really need to address initially and discuss with your line manager, just to make sure that actually they see your role and your background and the opportunities that you're going to be able to get in order to meet the requirements for PDS. If you come to your organisation as very much a specialist, whatever it might be, in modelling specifically, or for example, in developing travel plans, the PDS probably wouldn't be the right path for you, because you do need to gain that broad range of learning and experience in order to get through it. So that's the first thing that you need to do. Once you've made that decision, then the next thing really, next slide, Keith, is to join the Transport Planning Society. You can do it online. It's very easy. Most organisations will refund the membership. It costs £40 a year, I believe. I think it still is, isn't it, Keith, or has it gone up? I'm not sure. It's either 40 or 45.
Direct debit, it's still 40 quid.
Wow, marvellous. So it's a bargain, really. But you do need to do that in order to contribute to the costs that we have in terms of running the PDS itself. The next step really is to find a mentor, somebody that's going to help you through the scheme. And you do that either via discussing with your PDS manager, or your line manager will do that for you. Generally, mentors are allocated by the PDS manager, who keeps very much a constant overview of who's undertaken the training and what they're doing. So, and what mentors are available to you. Now, when you first see the scheme and you look at it and try and understand what it's all about, do remember, keep calm, find a mentor. They will help and support you in terms of identifying what you need to do and take you through the steps that you need to follow for the scheme. Next slide, Keith.
Is that working, Christine?
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you very much. Okay. So the next step really is very much to find out where your organisation saves the PDS documents, because although they are all on the Transport Planning Society website under the skills area, only mentors have access to that. You do need to have password, etc., to be able to access those documents online. So what we do ask is that all PDS managers, and do find out who your PDS manager is, obviously at the outset, where your PDS manager stores all the information on some form of SharePoint site or some folder within that you can access within your organization, and do have a look at all the documents that are there. Next slide, please. So to start off, do make sure that you record regularly what you learn and the experience that you gain. And I suggest that you do this when you fill out your timesheet each week, because you then have to scratch your head and think about, actually, what have I done this week in order to allocate your hours to charge out to particular clients. So when you're doing this, please do set up either a Word document or something, or just a little diary note that actually record, so that you can record separately also what you learn and what you do. Because that's really useful to you, because there are two ways that you can record progress going through the scheme. One is by producing a quarterly report, where you will just record everything and write about all the projects that you're working on and all the topic areas that you're learning about. And the second one is actually where you complete the objective record sheet directly and fill in there. So there are two ways of doing it. Some people find that actually doing quarterly reports initially is easier, because it's just you're recording what you've learned, what you've done. And at that stage, you don't necessarily need to know which objectives your learning or your experience actually contributes to, because your mentor can discuss it with you and I help you identify which objectives. Once you become familiar with the scheme itself and what all the objectives are about, then potentially you may find it easier to write directly into the objective record sheet. So there isn't any limit on the length of your records, but please remember that you need to be succinct really in capturing the key content of what you've learned and what you've done. And here, for those of you that may not have already seen what an objective record sheet looks like, they all follow this same template effectively, with the topic listed on the top and the objective number on the top right hand corner. This one is PR17. And you'll see on the left-hand side, under the requirement and the status for this particular objective, it's about experience. It's also mandatory. And under there, there's guidance which sets out actually what you need to do in, sorry, could we just go back to the previous slide, Keith? The guidance sets out quite clearly what needs to be covered in each particular objective. So you'll see the wording is very clear. For those objectives that require experience, it says you should have experience in. And in terms of what you record, you say, I have experience in this, or you don't have to put all of those, but I have done, etc. For the objectives that are around learning, the wording and the guidance is about you need to know or understand or have an awareness of, some wording of that sort. And on the right-hand side for your record or in your quarterly report, you need to record what you've learned, how you've learned it. Have you learned something by reading through documents, by just looking back on some of the modules you might have covered at university, which cover that particular topic, etc., or going to maybe lunch and learn sessions or specific training events. So this is really just very much to familiarize yourself with, actually, this is what the record sheets looks like. So when I talk about objective record sheets, then this is what I'm referring to, and they all look similar, but they're specific about that particular topic area. Thank you. In terms of quarterly reports, if you write a quarterly report, what we don't want you to do is to have to cut and paste everything that you've written up in your quarterly report into the objective record sheet itself. However, you do need to have a cross-reference to the document. So make sure that in your quarterly report, you number all of the actual reports and you have dates associated with them. You give paragraph numbers to every paragraph in the report and to every diagram, etc. And then when you come to completing the record sheet itself under your report, you can write in the example that's actually given here in red, the project name overall, and then reference to the work that you've done in that particular area. In this case, it's experience and proficiency. So it's quarterly report 3, the date, the paragraph number, and a short sentence or 2-sentence maximum of actually what did you do. And then each time that's what you do, and it's what you did specifically relevant to that particular objective. Okay, thank you. The next step really is while you're recording what you're learning and your experience, do meet regularly with your mentor. And I do suggest that initially, maybe every couple of weeks. I mean, we do know that most of these things take place on Zoom now, but whether it's Zoom or whether it's you meet them in the office, that's great. Do touch base with them regularly. And then you need to do quarterly as a minimum. However, more recently, we've found that many trainees and their mentors find it much easier to continue to meet monthly because there is less of a gap between whatever that learning or experience has been before they actually record it and report on it. And also it's much more helpful to touch base more regularly. And it doesn't necessarily mean it takes any more time because the meetings on a monthly basis would be that little bit shorter. So give that some thought as to what works best for you and your mentor. Do discuss that with your mentor and see how you feel it's best for you as an individual to proceed and go through the various steps of the scheme. Initially, do consider what you've done in your the work before you're working with your current organisation. What work did you do? What experience have you got? What learning might you have done from your degree modules? So do bear that in mind initially. Because what we do find is that you may have some degree modules. If you've done geography or even if you've done mathematics, you could do some data analysis, and there's lots about data analysis within the PDS. So there's a lot of learning that you can use from those degree modules, or maybe you've written a dissertation that is particularly relevant. So do look at those, and also potentially any experience that you might have gained, which may include any courses that you've been on, etc. So do think about that broadly first. And I often think it's quite helpful if you do decide to write quarterly reports to what I call writing up a quarterly report 0, which actually documents everything, all the learning and experience that you might have gained prior to your joining your current employer. Just the last point is really about, I think Keith mentioned it before, that actually when you do move from one employer to another, you can continue on the PDS and hopefully to completion. So the last point on here is about really read the documents. Do use the main document, which is either in a Word documentation or a PDF. Because that gives you an introduction. When you're using the Word or the Excel objective record sheets, the sort of basic information or introduction to the scheme isn't included. So do look at the key documentation, which I have a copy of. Can you see that, Keith?
I'm not sure.
No,
we can just,
sure
we can see the
okay,
cover.
I was just trying
We can
to.
see the diagram.
But but do have a look at the main documentation and run through the first few pages of it. There's only about 13 or 14 pages, but it is helpful to you. It does give you an outline of actually what we're going to talk about in a moment, but in more detail, and then you can look back on it. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, so here this is just a summary of all of the actions really for you to get started, and I do encourage you to do this as soon as possible. If you've already been with your employer for a month or two, then please just after this just go back and say, this is what I need to do and I need to get on with it, and record your learning experience on a regular basis, ideally at least every week, so that then you've got something to look back on. And you can make progress. It's much easier to make progress when you've got a few bullet points about actually what you've done that week. So I think this is a really helpful slide so you can tick off, these are the points that you need to follow in order to get started on the scheme. Thank you, Keith. Okay, so now I'm just going to run through a few hints and tips about really how the scheme operates, what works well within some organisations, and what you need to do really. So first and foremost is arrange a time with your mentor for a briefing. Sometimes the briefing's actually carried out by the PDS manager as such, so that may not be specifically relevant here when you talk about a briefing. However, do have a meeting set up on a regular basis with your mentor to run through and go through what you're recording, what you're doing, what progress you're making, and what you need to do next. That's a really key point to any meeting you have with your mentor. Don't leave it until you've actually discussed what's my next step. I think that's really helpful. Do find out about who else within your office is actually following the PDS, because it's really helpful to work with them, to get to know them, find out how much progress they've made on the scheme, what's their situation, what learning have they followed that you can actually sort of piggyback on, what learning have you done that they can piggyback on to get through some of the objectives which are about learning and knowing about topic areas. So do get to know and work with other trainees in your office. If you're in a small office and there's a larger one nearby, do find out who's working on the PDS there too, because obviously with Zoom, etc., and all sorts of working online, you can get to have meetings with them too, but do get to have a group of PDS trainees that you're working with. Share good practice within your organisation and reporting. Find out how others really draft their reports, if they're doing reports or if they're writing directly into the objective record sheet. Find out how they do it and see what way works best for you. You'll see that people do just often do it in slightly different ways. Some people have diary reports, some people have quarterly reports, monthly reports, some others write directly into the objective record sheets, or some write outside that. So see what the others do, but do talk to your mentor, talk to your PDS manager, and find out what's good practice and what generally people in your offices do. I've already mentioned about recording your learning experience weekly. I really think that's a really key thing for you to do, because it's really helpful. So I would really encourage you to do that. Next slide, Keith. And do think broadly about the projects that you work on in terms of what you've learned, what experience you're gaining. We do think that most projects have learning elements in different objectives. So Master might have a look at the numbers of objectives that there are in order to complete the scheme. Most projects will cover, half a dozen or more objectives. So please think broadly about what you do and get your mentor to help you do that. Do use the advice that they give you. Next slide. Keep up to date. Please do that. It makes life so much easier for you if you keep a regular record. You regularly produce something for your mentor. You set up meetings, you have them with your mentor on a regular basis. It really helps. I know we have people now that have sort of set out on the path, and they're really there's a few now that are completing the scheme within 3 years, because this is a graduate training scheme as such. So we are anticipating that people might take 3 or 4 years to do. But if you keep up to date, if you keep on top of it, potentially you should be able to do it within that time scale quite adequately. And if you are actually also following the graduate development programme potentially that your organisation runs, because we do know that some organisations actually run their own graduate development programme across all graduates in multiple disciplines. Please, if you're writing up information for that, you can also cross-reference that to your objective record sheet. You don't need to rewrite it, cross-reference to it, but have it available so that when the review time comes, your reviewer can access it and use it wherever available. Do actively look for opportunities to broaden your skills. So look at and find out what other projects potentially might be coming within your organisation, and look out for opportunities to work on those. Record your CPD and consider your next steps. I've already mentioned that when you have your meeting with your mentor. Next slide, Keith. So that's the hints and tips to getting started and moving forward. Make sure you arrange time with your mentor. Oh, it's the next slide. Sorry, Keith.
Okay.
So do meet with your mentor, as I mentioned, at least every 3 months. I think more regularly when you start on the scheme, and potentially you might feel that actually monthly works better for you. Your mentor will review what you've done in terms of your quarterly report. They'll read through it and identify some of the objective record sheet or objectives that that particular work contributes to. The mentor will sign off objectives that have been completed and potentially resolve any issues. And the last point again about agreeing the next steps.
Okay, well, I'm going to make a few points about the PDS documents and structure and the level of competence required. First of all, just to say that you do need to be familiar, as Christine has said, with the main document of the PDS, and this is now version 4, and we introduced that earlier, and this is now the current version that you should be on. For those of you on 3.1, don't worry, you can carry on and complete under version 3.1, and in fact that's what we are seeing in terms of the current completions. Obviously people are completing on version 3.1. We do allow some mixing of the two, where people have completed a whole unit in 3.1 and want to do another one in 4. It does create some inconvenience, and I've got to say that there has been a bit of confusion between 3.1 and 4, so we do prefer people to use 4, but absolutely, if you're starting the PDS, you must start on version 4. But we're quite happy to see applications based on 3.1 and are continuing to do so. Other documents that you may find, being a PDS mentor, that's a very, again, a useful base document, and there are various other ones to support. The overview document with a few quotes from people who've been through it, getting started on the PDS, and of course the advice notes, which is quite an important aspect of the scheme. Although we've just completed a major revision, we haven't done any advice notes so far this year, but I dare say there will, well, there's a couple that we're thinking of producing. So it's important to keep up to date with the advice notes, because they are designed to help you through the scheme, and they're generated basically when people have a problem. They contact us and they say, I'm having difficulty with this particular record sheet, can you issue some advice that would help me through? So that's a very sort of active part of the scheme, and all those documents, as we say here, they're available to the PDS manager and to the mentors on the specific area of the TPS website, but hopefully they're going to be shared through your local web sharing site, whether it's SharePoint or whatever else. So moving to the PDS itself, basically there are kind of 6 broad areas of skills. I've used the word unit before, and there are 16 specific units in PDS, and then below that are the actual record sheets allocated to each of the units. So we have actually in the last few years reduced those down. I think in version 3 we were looking at possibly around just over 80 record sheets. As part of making revising the PDS in light of the TPP revisions, we did go through the units and try and get rid of duplication and rationalize things a bit, and we have managed to get it down to a more containable series of record sheets, and we think around about 50 are needed because some of them are options, so around about 50 to complete the scheme. Okay, so I mentioned the six areas and 16 units, and here they are set out. Notice that some of them are in red and some of them are in blue. The red ones are what we call the core units, and you will have to achieve at least awareness and knowledge in those. But of course there are options in those same units to go for experience. And in the blue ones, we don't say that you have to have experience in these, but you will have to show some knowledge in at least a couple of them. So all the options we'll come to later, but the basic structure is the core units and the optional units at knowledge and at experience. So I've mentioned awareness, knowledge, experience. So now I'm going to say a little bit about what they are. And in broad terms, awareness is a general understanding of an area of transport planning, such as appraisal or travel planning, a general area. And I sort of put it this way: you know of the elements that exist. You know things are out there. You have a reasonable idea of what they are and what they're for, but you don't have enough detailed knowledge to actually apply them. So you might have heard of a multi-criteria analysis. You might have a sort of general idea of what it is, but you don't know enough to be able to explain it or to use it. And that's where knowledge comes in. Really, you have to understand at a greater depth the specific elements of learning that is concerned. I gave the example of appraisal there. You have to know a lot more about it, such that that knowledge could be used in a project situation. So that's awareness and knowledge. Awareness is kind of the big picture, but not at a deep level, and knowledge is much more specific and targeted, and we expect to see detailed knowledge at that level, and usable knowledge, I think, is the important point. And that brings me on to the two ones here: experience and proficiency. Proficiency is only really required in the PDS in data, but is clearly a major element when you come to the TPP qualification. And in both cases, we're looking at a consistent ability. So we would like to see, we need to see more than one example of experience or proficiency. And in experience, you might typically be part of a team carrying out work and reporting to a project manager or a senior colleague. In proficiency, you might go away and actually do something yourself, relatively unsupervised, collect some data, analyze it, and present a report on it, or contribute part of a report, which is very largely under your control. We only ask for this in data in the PDS, and in fact, we only ask in each record sheet in data, we only ask for one example of proficiency. Obviously, if you're completing the scheme in 3 years, your ability to acquire proficiency is limited. We do, however, and this was again the subject of feedback from the users, from the PDS managers and mentors, they wanted some higher level of experience in the data area, and that's why we've kept proficiency. Okay, just to say what this involves, and here you'll see it's important that you always think about what you learned or what you did. So for awareness and knowledge here, it's how I undertook the learning, what I learned, and when I gained it. And it's not about your team or organization, it's all about you. Again, same for proficiency, how I undertook the work, what I did, when, we do need to know that recorded, and the role that you played. That's particularly important for experience. So if you say, I worked on, that's a little bit vague. We want to know your position in the team, how big the team was, that sort of thing. I've got actually a duplicate slide there, so I go over to experience and proficiency just to say this is important, that it is a consistent ability, and that's why we require more than one example. Incidentally, just to clarify on that, if you do have a very, very big project that you've been working on, you might have 2 pieces of work within that big project, which you need to cite as different examples. But for most cases, we need more than one project example. And the breadth and depth of competence is the key here. Okay. I'm just going to finish this bit by saying, well, one of the useful things that you can do is, together with your mentor, try to keep an overview of progress. And we do provide a progress chart in the main documentation, and I think it's quite important to use that. Or obviously, if you're working from your own spreadsheet version, to use that as well. It's very useful. It's useful for reviewers, but it's also particularly useful for you recording your progress on the scheme. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Christine for a bit.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the completion requirements, because you've seen now the sort of structure of the scheme. You know that there's broad areas, underneath those sit units, and underneath the units sit objectives. So the next slide will give you a list of all of the areas on the left hand side, then a list of the units that sit in those areas and those titles. It's also quite helpful because on the in the next column to the right of the title, it says mandatory completion level. So that's what you must do in order to complete the scheme. So here you can see that for PR1 and 2, the mandatory level is knowledge. We've touched on the fact that data is fundamental to everything we do in transport planning, and therefore the level there actually requirement is at proficiency level. But what you do need to do is to look at each objective record sheet, and it will be very clear on there what level you have to do it to. Because in PR1, that's the unit PR1, there will be a number of objectives, some of which require knowledge and others which are optional will require experience. So do be clear on looking carefully at the objective record sheets and make sure that only those knowledge ones are mandated. Now, in addition to complete the scheme, you need to select, if you look at the final column on the right, under the header of options, there are 9 units that sit under there. And you actually need to complete 5 of those at experience level in order to complete the scheme. So there are a few rules about how you can choose them. You can only choose a maximum of 2 from the PD and O units. So looking at the bottom 4 there, which is PD1 and 2 and O1 and 2, you can only choose 2 from those. But you don't actually have to choose any at experience level, because you can choose the 5 at the top, PR1 and 2, TT 2, 3 and 4, 2, 3 and 4, yes, that's right, and that gives you 5. However, if you don't do any from the PD&O, you will need to do some additional learning units from there just to cover those particular areas. So if you could go on to the next slide, Keith. This is just a list really of the 9 units that were in the right hand column of the previous slide. So for completion, looking at completion possibility 1, the column there says if you chose all 5 from PR and TT, which I mentioned just now, you will need to do 2 additional units at knowledge level. And each of those actually only has 1 objective for it. So it's not like doing, another half a dozen objective record sheets. There's only 1 for each of those. For completion possibility 2, if you choose 4 from the PR and TT, 1 from PD&O, then you will need to do 1 other unit at knowledge level. And the final completion possibility 3 is where you do 3 experiences from PR and TT and 2 from PD&O, and that is sufficient to complete the scheme. So it's quite straightforward, really, and all of this information, as I mentioned earlier, is in sort of front end of the PDS documentation. So do be aware of it and know about it. This is not something that's we've developed specifically for this presentation and you can't find anywhere else. So that's the important thing, I think, about having a copy of the whole documentation to hand, not just the objective record sheets themselves. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back in and say a few words about the review process. Some of you may have come across this already. Some of you will be coming up for one in the near future, I hope. So a few words about the review process. It's now fairly long established. We introduced it in 2014, and it's designed to really meet the need for consistency across the scheme and between the different PDS users. So we have obviously the mentors must be regularly trained and refresher trained, and the PDS trainees will be reviewed at least twice during their 3 to 4 year period, and they get a certificate of completion at the end. And the thing we've introduced most recently was in 2018. They can now use the post-nominal ink TP. So I'm going to say a little bit about it in more detail now. The initial review, basically, we have a look at a sample of record sheets that will have been filled in and supplied in advance. So we're looking at the record sheets. We're looking at the overall progress and whether there are any issues about how both the learning and experience are being acquired. And basically what we're trying to do here, one of the most important things that we do, is work through the sample record sheets with the trainee. And actually nowadays we're increasingly doing that with the mentor. So we talk to the trainee and the mentor about the record sheet and go through it in some detail. And that's important because for the first review, if we can get people on the right track early on, it means that apart from possibly them checking in with us or asking a specific question or saying, I'm having trouble with this individual record sheet, here's what I'm thinking of putting on it, what do you think? And emailing it across. That's not a formal review, but we're happy to have a look at individual record sheets on that basis. But the first review should really set you on the path. And hopefully most people are finding that useful. Just to say, we have a kind of session at the end of that, a brief session summing up where we think you've got to in terms of completing the record sheets, but we do submit a written report based on our analysis of the sheets and our review with you. So that review is very much, we've endlessly talked about changing the title. It's really a support review at that particular stage. The final review is a little bit different. Obviously, we need to, this is much more of an assessment based on your record sheets. So you have to fill in the form, you have to send in, tell us what completion option you've gone for, obviously, supply the record sheets to us, and then we will analyze them. And in addition to that, for the final review, we ask a brief presentation on some key aspects of a project that you've worked on, following which we'll ask some questions. That usually takes about half an hour. And then after that, we will go on and we will ask questions based on the record sheets themselves. And this can be anything from about 10 to 20 questions and last 45 minutes to an hour. And after the final review, several things can happen. One, and this doesn't happen because we have various filters beforehand, we would say you need to rewrite most of your application or a lot of your application and reapply. Or we might say there's one aspect or two aspects that we'd still like a little bit more information on. Give us a written submission on that, and that can easily be anywhere between 500 and 1500 words. And that's quite normal and quite often happens, and indeed can happen in the TPP as well. So that's one of the options. And the other option is we just say, you've completed the PDS, congratulations, on which basis you'll get one of these. And I thought it was useful just to show the certificate on the screen because this is what you're aiming for. So I think some key points about this. Um, it's important to keep the RSs up to date, as Christine's has talked about. Um, update your reports, and signed, once you think you've reached the right level, if you think, oh, actually, I've just done a project, kind of signed off that one, but I've got a bit more I can do. Make a note of it, because when you come to your TPP, particularly on, as it says here, an experience or proficiency, record it for yourself, because it's going to be useful to you and it will speed up and make your TPP application less burdensome. Finally, of course, do keep a running CPD record. That's important. We always look at that as part of the first review and final review, and TPP will look at it as well. So since I've talked a lot about the TPP, I'm gonna finish today's webinar really with a few words about the TPP. First of all, we always show this diagram. Has been around for a long time, trying to put the whole thing in context. That you have some sort of academic base, you go through a professional development process, and at the end of that, you can become a professional. And as part of that professional status, you do need to have continuous professional development. So this tries to put it in some sort of context. And the PDS really gets you up the ladder in terms of your professional development, and of course signs you off for the knowledge requirements of TPP, which I mention on this slide. So once you've done the PDS, once you've completed it successfully, you won't have to do a written portfolio of technical knowledge for the TPP. So the PDS, in terms of, is kind of part one of the TPP done, and it's important that obviously that technical knowledge is complete. Some of the experience you'll need from the TPP will be provided as part of the PDS, although it will probably need to be rewritten in the TPP format. And experience will include most, not all of the technical skills, but most of them. But the big difference is that you will have to show proficiency in those same units that you may only have shown experience, or in some cases knowledge, in the PDS units. The main advantage of all this is, of course, that the PDS structure maps directly to the TPP. And in this slide, we simply put the TPS, PDS and the TPP units up together. I will make one further comment on this, which I think is quite important, and that is that since the TPP revisions, the PDS and the TPP have actually got even closer than they were before. And this is particularly true, I think, of our CCE units, where the TPP was perhaps a bit more vague than we were, and that did cause some comment. But we can now see that actually in the revised TPP, an increasing importance has been placed on the professional units, P1 to 3. In fact, they used to be called the B units, and the TPP governance bodies decided we'd call them P units rather than imply they were secondary in any way whatsoever. So that has come forward, and I think that's made the work that you will do completing those CCE units and the management units actually even more valuable than it was before in completing the TPP. So here we are. We've got basically that both of these schemes are working towards the same standards. Again, main differences here. We only require experience for 5 technical units, but for the TPP, you will require more. You will require proficiency for 3 technical units, and indeed for all the P units that I've just been talking about. So it's basically a much uh, higher level of experience and proficiency than we have in the PDS, but basically in the same areas and the same units. So I think that sort of concludes what I wanted to say on PDS and TPP. Christine, I think we're going to finish.
Yes, I think we're just going to sum up. Sorry, there isn't just another slide about the key differences. Keith, I don't know whether you want to mention about the bigger picture.
Yep, sorry. I did want to say that the competencies are reviewed individually through the record sheets. For the TPP, and the reason that the experience, as I said, will need rewriting, is that the competencies are more viewed as a whole, and their relationships with each other are much more important. So it is about connecting up the units, whereas for the PDS we're actually looking at them one by one. And also for TPP there'll be some investigation really of your ability to achieve the big picture, as I said, to knit all these things together and to use them to do the sort of problem solving that I'm sure some of you are already involved in and hopefully enjoying. So you're quite right, Christine. I nearly missed off that last slide.
Okay. Right,
I am
well,
human.
Sorry. I just didn't want you to miss that bit out. Right, if
No,
we
quite right.
get through. So apologies. Anyway, just moving on and just summing up really now is all that's left to do, and to open up to questions from anyone on the call. So really what we're saying now is actually the objectives of this webinar were set out clearly at the start to clarify what you needed to do to get started, to provide you with hints and tips, and to give you an understanding of the PDS sort of at a high level. You won't from this actually have grasped everything, as you appreciate. We haven't gone through every objective record sheet, so that's left for you to do and for you to talk and discuss with your mentor about them and how your work and learning contributes to them. We have gone through what the completion requirements are, and Keith's carefully gone through the review process, which I think is really important. And what I would just emphasize here about the review process, it's really designed to be, certainly the initial review, really helpful to you to give you some insight into actually, are you providing the evidence in the right manner? Is there a better way of doing it? Are you writing too much, too little, etc.? Albeit your mentor should be able to help you and advise you on that. But it is really helpful to get that reviewer feedback on it. And then finally, Keith hopefully explained quite clearly how the PDS leads to TPP, and how very much we've noticed that those that have completed the PDS find that path to TPP a lot more straightforward than those that haven't, because they already have all the records of their learning and their experience, albeit it may only be for the first 3 to 4 years of their life as a transport planner. However, they do have that, and that's something that's really fundamental, and they can call on that when they need to write up the forms that they need to apply for TPP. But it is really useful. So I'll just really hand back in a way to open up and ask if people have any questions about anything to do with the PDS, because we're very happy to answer them. I don't know whether you've got any come through, Keith, on the
I'm just looking,
chat line, or
I'm just looking at it right. I've just got it up to have a look at right now.
I hope everyone's still awake. There's still everyone is still on the call, so I'd like to think that at least a few of you will have some questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think. Yeah. Well, we've got 20. I think we've got 28 people on the call. So I'm interested to if anybody wants to put their hand up, that would also be possible. I'm happy to handle it that way. But at the moment,
we don't have any.
okay. fine. I've got something in the chat box. Good. I was a bit worried it might not be working. So okay, fine. How long on average would a full completion of PDS through to TPP and CTPP? Ah, okay. This is a very good one. In when we were running the PDS with proficiency requirements, it was possible to move to the TPP incredibly quickly. But the PDS was taking 7 years. So on that basis, if you translate that, if you do the PDS and complete in 3 to 4 years, you'll be halfway to TPP. That's the sort of thing that, now, having said that, it entirely depends on whether you can get the breadth of proficiency. And in many ways, that's easier to acquire earlier in your career before you get too specialized or too good at one thing that everybody wants you to do all the time. So it's important to bear that in mind. But I would think that's a reasonable sort of timescale. The one on the CTPP is easy to answer. It takes about 5 minutes, I think. Basically, because once you've got TPP, you just send a small sum of money to the CIHT, who will issue you with a chartered certificate. Basically, the qualification is the TPP, and we had to go through various legal constraints, but CIHT are now able to send you a chartered certificate and convert you to CTPP literally when they receive the check and process it. So there's no extra time or indeed any extra qualification required for the chartership. It's basically it confers a chartership title on TPP holders. I hope that explains it. Yeah, another question. How many years experience PDS versus TPP? Again, as Christine said, if you work with your mentor so that you've got sufficient breadth of experience to get those 5 options that we've talked about, there's no reason that you couldn't complete in 3 years. That's absolutely fine. That's certainly true now for version 3.1 and version 4. It's definitely that length of time. Right, I've got another one here. Yeah, about the presentation. This is a good question, actually. We don't often get questions asked about the presentation bit. There aren't any. I mean, what happens usually is that people have got a current project or a recent project that they got particularly involved in. So we don't stipulate what it should be. We do ask that it should relate to the units in the PDS, but it'd be pretty unlikely if you're working on a project that didn't. But obviously it's got to be relevant to the sort of competencies that we're looking at in PDS. But I wouldn't say there are any particular requirements. It does need, however, and you mentioned this in your question, we are always interested in the PDS in what you did. So if you give us a presentation about what someone else did in your organization or how good your organization is, then we're not going to be very happy about it. It's got to comply with that basic rule that the PDS submission is all about you, what you learned, what you did, and that's the most important thing to us. But apart from that, there are no specific rules about the project, and we do get people who present sometimes on 2 projects on a theme, for example. You can do that, so we're very open to that, and indeed that's also true for TPP. I should just say that incidentally, the whole final the PDS final review is exactly like the TPP review. presentation and questions, plus questions on the written submission. It's identical. It's actually quite good practice. So, and of course, afterwards in PDS final review, we'll give you some hints and tips and pointers for the future in relation to TPP. So I hope that answers that question. Christine, I've done all the talking. Did you want to add anything on that, or?
Not really. I think I think it's helpful to have a presentation which actually touches on a few of the topic areas rather than stay specifically about travel planning or something of that ilk. But we haven't got any particular rules about what you have to present, and it's, as Keith says, it's very much about what you've learned from those projects, and what your experience of it was. What did you do? What was the outcome of the project? How did you feel about the work that you did on it? Did it go to plan? And it's always useful to hear about actually what potentially you might do better next time.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions come in here. Right, first one, do you recap the advantages? Oh, okay, this is a very good question, because obviously I haven't covered every aspect of TPP. That would definitely require a whole other webinar. And in fact, we've just worked with CIHT to make one on the standard route, and we're working on one for the senior route now. So to recap, basically I said if you complete the PDS, you don't need to do a portfolio of technical knowledge. That is also true if you do an MSc, which is accredited. In other words, it's been judged to cover the same ground that the TPP requires. So the PDS does that, but so does an accredited master's. So you won't actually have to do the PDS if your sole reason for doing the PDS is to avoid a PTK. Obviously, we think that there are a lot of other things that are helpful to do the PDS, because it gets you to record your experience as well, which you will definitely need for TPP, and it gives you a good run at the review, and it gives you some advice as to what to do for TPP. Now, if you do decide to go for PDS completion and you've done an accredited master's, then obviously you can use the accredited master's as a source for your record sheets. So it's going to give you a huge head start in completing the awareness and knowledge requirements. So you'll be able to go to your record sheets and say, in this module I did this, and that will be an easy example. And hopefully, because it's an accredited master's, you should find examples for most of the content that you need. So if you've done an accredited master's, that can be very useful for the PDS, but it would allow you to bypass the PDS if you wanted to and go straight for TPP. I have to say that's quite an ask without any sort of further mentoring. So I hope that says. Right. Is PDS specific to the TPS? Actually, the PDS is specific to TPS members. So you have to be a member of TPS. Two reasons for that. One, it makes sure you're covered by our code of conduct, which is important to us. And secondly, it helps support the PDS itself. Some of the income comes from the licensees, but some of the income obviously comes from the fact that you're a member of TPS. So you would, in this specific instance, need to be a member of TPS while you're on the PDS. So that was I hope, a relatively simple question, and do come back if I haven't answered it. Okay. And okay, that was a message from someone who's got to go. Okay. Any Any other questions come forward for chat? I think, well, I can't see any more at the moment. Okay. I think if there aren't any more questions, thank you for those. I'm going to close the webinar. Christine, is there anything you wanted to say in closing, or have we anything
No, I
you've
don't
picked
think
up?
so. I hope we've gone through everything. Just to say to all trainees that actually your first port of call when you've got any queries is your mentor. If your mentor's not very clear on it, hopefully they would liaise with other mentors in your organisation and the PDS manager. But if the PDS manager doesn't know the answers to your questions, then we are available, and
We're
please
always here.
do come to us.
Definitely. Okay.
So there's always support for you. So please don't feel that you can't get an answer. Do come to us.
Great. Well, with
Okay,
that, I'm going to say thank you very much. And good luck with the PDS. Hope to see some of you for first or final reviews very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye.